Welcome to the Serving Library, to Exhibition Research Lab, to Liverpool John Moores University, and to Liverpool Biennial 2018. This is the fifth of a series of 10 talks that have been commissioned by Liverpool Biennial 2018 to the Serving Library in response to the title of the biennial, which you probably know, which is a question, and goes, "Beautiful world, where are you?" So we asked a number of different people, different thinkers from different disciplines to try and address somehow this very difficult question. So tonight is the turn of Meehan Crist, and I am delighted to welcome her here. Thank you for being here with us. She is a writer in residence in biology at Columbia University in New York. And I didn't know what a writer in residence in biology was. I don't know if you know. It's a strange title. So she teaches both to creative writing students and to biology students. Like, imagine how amazing that is. I think it's amazing. And she's not a biologist, she's a writer. So before that, she used to be a reviews editor at literary journal The Believer, and prior to that, she used to be editor-at-large at Science's magazine Nautilus. And I guess that when we decided to invite her to speak as part of this series, was when we realized that she was the same author of an amazing article that we read on the London Review of Books about a book about an impossible translation of an impossibly interesting manuscript called the Voynich manuscript, so a very, very literary kind of, sort of issue to talk about, and the author of an equally amazing article on The Atlantic about the Fiji archipelago and the acidification of the oceans and coral reef, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we thought, okay, great. So this will be the person that we will ask to talk about climate change somehow, in some way. So here she is. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much to Francesca and to Stuart and the Serving Library for having me here. I really, really appreciate it. I'm also exceedingly jet-lagged and 7 months pregnant, so if at some point I just space out and start staring into a wall, it's fine, everything's fine, I'll be okay. But apologies in advance. So the talk today, you gonna adjust a little?
Like that.
Great. Okay, I'll try to go near it. Is titled Climate Grief and the Visible Horizon. And I thought that we might start with a story from Ovid. So this is a story of Phaethon and Phoebus. Just out of curiosity, how many of you know this story? It's interesting, it doesn't get told a lot. So here's what's happening. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, it's the second book, opens with this story, which is actually the longest story in the book. And Phaethon is the son of Phoebus, who is the sun god, and he's also the son of a mortal woman. So he's living on Earth with his mortal mother and feeling like he's not been recognized by the sun god as his rightful son. So he goes up into the sky to go visit the sun god and asks his father to bestow some kind of sign that he is indeed his father. He wants to prove to everyone back down on Earth that he is the person he says he is. So Phoebus says, "Ask me whatever favor you want, I will bestow it." And the boy says, "I want to drive the chariot." So the chariot is the chariot that goes across the sky every day, drawn by these sort of magnificent horses, and it takes the sun through the day. And in order to do this, the chariot has to pass through all of the, what we think of as like the zodiac, right? There's the bull and the crab and all these sort of terrifying things along the way. And Phoebus says, Phoebus says, "Please ask me for anything else. Don't ask me to give you something that can only end in your demise. Because you're too young, you're not strong enough, even the other gods can't control this chariot." And the boy is just headstrong and bent on driving the chariot, and finally his father relents and gives him the reins, and off he goes into the sky. The horses take one look at the terrifying things up there in the celestial firmament, and they bolt. And the kid cannot control the horses. He's going way out into sort of outer reaches of space and going back down far too close to Earth, and he begins scorching the Earth. And there are these really beautiful passages. This is from the translation by David Rayburn. The earth now burst into flames on all of the hills, and the mountains split into huge wide cracks and dried as it lost its moisture. The corn turned white, and the trees were charred into leafless skeletons. Parched grain offered the perfect fuel for self-ruination. These losses were trifling. Destruction fell upon great walled cities. Mighty nations with all their peoples, the conflagration turned to ashes. And a little bit later, Phaethon now looked down on a world in flames. Wrapped in the pitchy darkness, he didn't know where he was going. So there's this moment where he's sort of hung in the sky with these horses running wild and looking down, and everything's on fire. There's then a very moving story, part of the story where the earth beseeches a greater god than Phoebus, goes to Jupiter and says, Jupiter, you have to do something, I'm dying. The earth, scorched and parched-lipped, beseeches Phoebus, the boy's father. Look round at the two poles. Smoke is pouring from each. If they suffer from fire, the halls of the gods will collapse. See, Atlas himself is in trouble. His shoulders can barely sustain the weight of the white-hot vault. I beg you to rescue what is left from the flames. Think of the universe. So Jupiter hears this plea, fires a thunderbolt at the boy and at the chariot. He is instantly killed, and his corpse comes raining down from the heavens with his hair on fire like a comet, and the horses go plunging into the ocean. There's a denouement in which all of his sisters are turned into trees, as the sisters of people tend to be turned into in Ovid. And also then his father is stricken with despair and melancholy and doesn't want to ride the chariot anymore, but the other gods get together and say, you're the only one that can do this, we need the day, you have to take the chariot across the sky. He agrees to. So this story, I'm drawn to this story because there's a very obvious way to read this story as a metaphor for climate change. And sometimes it is, in fact, a little bit too on the nose. I don't know if you saw the news this week, but the Arctic Circle's on fire, as was mentioned in the story. It is hot in here today also, right? We're having this crazy heat wave. Japan had its hottest temperature in recorded history, 106 degrees Fahrenheit. Over 22,000 people have been hospitalized. In Greece, at least 80 people have been killed when winds whipped up, wildfires stoked by high heats. So anyone knows who has been following climate change news, or just the news, that things are fairly dire and fairly hot. So to go back to the story of Phoebus and Phaethon for a moment, there's a very neat way to read this where humanity is the boy, right? There's this kind of hubris, desire for control, taking control of a thing that was never meant to be ours, and sort of running the world into destruction. And in fact, Ted Hughes wrote a poem sort of based on this in Tales from Ovid. He uses this specifically as a climate change metaphor. But I think that we can read it a little differently, and I'm interested in shifting the identification from the boy to the people who are on Earth. Because much like climate change now, the on-the-noseness of this story involves a bunch of marginalized people who are not actually responsible for the destruction that they are seeing, living through that destruction. And they remain basically voiceless in this poem. So what if we as readers shift our identification to the people on Earth and start imagining what the people in those cities that are burning to the ground and in those fields that are burning up, the rivers are drying up, right? Those people who are just watching all of that happen. What does it feel like to watch that kind of destruction? What kind of horror and what kind of grief do they feel? I'm particularly interested in this question of grief. in part because we're all feeling this in different ways. Wanted to bring this a little bit closer to home. Again, lovely weather we're having here today in the UK. Is anyone in here familiar with the jet stream? Anyone worried about a new dawn of an ice age in Europe? Because that could happen. And it could happen faster and sooner than was previously thought. This is also a country of substantial coastline. Do any of you have concern about sea level rise? There's nodding, there's eyebrows. A lot of eyebrows just went up. So I don't know the east of England very well, but according to The Guardian, Lincolnshire is an area of flat, low-lying agricultural plains which stretch north from the fens, curling around the Wash to Skegness and Grimsby. So due to rising sea levels, there's already a managed retreat underway here. How many of you have seen these maps? Similar ones like this? Yeah. I'm from New York, and we have maps of the city sort of going underwater in various iterations. So if global temperatures rise by 3 degrees, the area will have to be abandoned completely to the sea. There's no seawall that's going to keep the water back. There's no way to keep farming this land. The food that is grown on it will be lost. This just has to be finished if we get to 3 degrees. We are already well on our way to passing the aspirational limit of 2 degrees warming set by the Paris Climate Agreement, which is, I don't know if you guys know this, actually based on a carbon sequestration technology that does not exist. So it's very aspirational. There's a great piece in Wired by Abigail Rabinowitz if you're interested in that. We're also not likely to make that 2 degree limit because it would require basically a reorganization of global economic systems and power structures at a moment when the stability of those structures is eroding, and it seems like international cooperation is at an all-time strained moment. So that doesn't seem very likely to happen. We're not going to stop using fossil fuels in the next 5 years, and we've already put enough carbon dioxide into the air to keep having effects. Even if we were to stop using carbon dioxide today, those effects are going to continue to get worse for many, many years. So when you think about climate change, and I'm sort of throwing all of these terrifying things at you, how does that make you feel? Do you feel despair? Do you feel anger? Do you feel just overwhelmed? Do you get numb? Do you think of a family member who has a home that's in danger? Do you think of a home that you yourself have that is potentially in danger from flooding or fires? My parents live in California, and there were huge fires there recently, and they had all of their belongings packed in the car, and I'm riding the subway in New York, and it was very, very hard to wrap my head around the fact that they're just waiting to see if they have to run away from their home that might be on fire in any moment. It's hard to know how to feel in those moments. Collectively and individually, we are experiencing what no generation of humans has ever faced, which is grieving the ongoing loss of the planet as we have known it. This can mean something like loss of homes to fire and flood, but it can also mean things like loss of your favorite childhood beach, right? A place that you identify with, that feels like home, that feels like part of who you are, that is now gone, that you can never go back to. It also means, for a lot of people, loss of jobs, loss of income, food security. When fisheries collapse because there are no fish in the sea, you are losing whole towns and cities and industries that are based on those fish existing. So then what happens? What do you do if you're one of those people? How do you feel? We don't really have good language for talking about this kind of grief, and we don't really know what it looks like yet. The contours are kind of blurry. So we don't know how to think about and therefore process this grief in a way that might enable us to move forward. So I thought I would look at a few grief paradigms that we do have to see how they can help us understand this particular moment. So Freud's Mourning and Melancholia. This is a sort of classic essay in which he defines the difference between mourning and melancholia, mourning being a totally normal human reaction to loss, usually of a loved one, But he also calls it the loss of some abstraction which has taken the place of one, such as one's country, liberty, an ideal, or so on. So basically it's the loss of something meaningful. It's totally normal to go through a process of mourning and feel sad about that. Melancholia is different. Melancholia includes a prolonged period of mourning, and it also includes all of the same sort of features, but in addition to the normal mourning features, there's this pathological skewing of self-regard. You basically start to hate yourself a little bit. And he doesn't completely say why, but he says profound mourning, the reaction to the loss of someone who is loved, contains the same painful frame of mind, the same loss of interest in the outside world, the same loss of capacity to adopt any new object of love, which would mean replacing him, which is really interesting, this idea that you're hanging on to the thing that was lost or the person that was lost, because if you let them go, then you have to love something else, and it's like a rejection of that previously loved thing. And then there's this disturbance of self-regard. So other than the disturbance of self-regard, they're very, very similar processes, but one just won't end, and you end up sort of transfixed and frozen in this melancholia. Moving a little later in time, we have the classic Kübler-Ross 5 stages of grief, 5 stages of grief, which most of you have probably heard of: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I rather like this image because the acceptance hill is higher than the first hill. There's some implication here that you've actually moved up and forward and ended up somewhere better than you were before the loss, which I think is really interesting. And this aligns more or less with Freud's idea of mourning, but sort of breaks it into stages. There's another paradigm that sort of came up in the 1990s with a new term called complicated grief. And this was coined to describe prolonged grief associated with a death. So it's more like melancholia. If Kübler-Ross is mourning, this is melancholia. And the symptoms of complicated grief are the same as those of normal grief, but the defining element is the duration of the feelings. You get stuck in this form of very acute grief where the future seems bleak and empty. And that idea of the future being bleak and empty being a feature of this pathological mourning seems potentially useful for us in thinking about climate change. So complicated grief is one in which the griever experiences these negative symptoms as a way of remaining connected to the lost loved ones. So again, we have that sort of echo of Freud of the grief is a form of love. And if you stop grieving, you have stopped loving somehow, and that in itself is painful. Let's see. So according to Dr. Catherine Shear at Columbia University, this occurs in only a very small percentage of people. For people that suffer with this problem, their other relationships tend to be very difficult. Ultimately, they can have other health issues, particularly mental health issues. And many with this diagnosis lose a purpose for living. The diagnosis of complicated grief is most often reserved for those who have a family or personal history of mental health disorders, but grief can be complicated for many, many reasons. But basically, it's an inability to process the grief. It's an inability to sort of emotionally handle it in that sort of proper sense of mourning. So both the Kübler-Ross paradigm and this complicated grief paradigm stress finality, right? Someone has died, something is gone, there has been a very concrete loss, and it is sort of the job of the mourner to grieve appropriately and move on. This doesn't really map onto climate change because we don't know what the loss is in many cases. If you look at sea level rise, we don't know, if we go back to our map over here, this is maybe a worst case scenario, but it's not clear that this is the end point, right? We might end somewhere a little sooner than this. In 200 years, we may be much further than this. And so you don't have that finality with which to grapple and sort of decide how to move forward. So ambiguous loss, I think, is maybe more useful for us. In classic grief paradigms, where the object of attachment has gone and has to be mourned, you have this sort of mourner and object relationship. So this was a psychological paradigm established in the 1970s by Pauline Boss, who was studying and working with people who had family members that went missing in action. So you had the object of love was gone, but not finally, right? It seemed like they might be able to come back. A friend of mine was recently telling me a story about a friend of her mother who had a son who went missing in action, and 20 years later, someone in uniform was walking up to the house, and she went racing out the front door thinking it might be him. There is no sort of end to the possibility that this thing might return. So that's sort of one type of this ambiguous loss. The other type of ambiguous loss is where the object of your love is still physically present, but psychologically absent. So this would be something like someone with Alzheimer's. And this is when the person is still there, you can still sit by them and hold their hand, and you can still feel love for them, and you can still be in the same room with them, but they're not there. And they're not there in a complicated, shifting, sliding way where you're never sure how much they are or aren't there at any given moment. So how do you grieve the loss of someone who's literally sitting right in front of you? Even in this paradigm where there's this ambiguous loss, it doesn't map perfectly to climate change because the end point is still known, right? At least with the Alzheimer's patient, for example, you know that they are going to die at the end of that process. There is going to be a finality. In the case of the soldier missing in action, that's more complicated, but sometimes that does end up getting resolved. You do get information later that can change that process. But with climate change, you can think about it like if you are living in a house on the edge of one of these coastal areas, if you are in Miami or Lagos or the eastern coast of the UK, and floods are rising, but they come sometimes. Sometimes your house floods. But you've kind of figured out how to deal with it. You put the things up from the basement, and you make sure everything is basically safe, and hope that the water's not going to rise so far that it washes away all your belongings. But this is happening more and more regularly in cities all around the world. So Jeff Goodell wrote a really amazing book called The Water Will Come, about cities and climate change, which I highly recommend, that just looks at all of the ways that water is sort of rising into cities around the world. So at what point do you say, this house is no longer livable? At what point do you say, I'm willing to give this up because I have to? And how do you make that decision when you don't have the resources to get yourself another house, right? How do you make that decision when your government is not willing to buy you out and you're just kind of pleading for help from organizations that may or may not be able to help you? In the case of, in that case, it would be like the Alzheimer's patient, right? The thing is physically present, but kind of disappearing. In the case of climate refugees, you have the opposite case, where if you come from the Pacific Islands somewhere, the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and your islands are basically going underwater, and you have to leave, you often go to a place where there's a community of other people from the Marshall Islands, from Kiribati, where you're trying to hang on to a culture and an identity that has been built over a lifetime of living on these islands, which is very much psychologically present and with you. And there's always this kind of sense of maybe one day when we go back, maybe it's still there, maybe it's not. I don't know how not there it is now, but it is with me in my entire person here. What are you supposed to grieve? What are you letting go of, and where is that point of finality so that you can then move on? The incentive to wait and see in both of these cases, if you're sitting in a house that may or may not be underwater in 20 years, or if you are, sitting in Michigan somewhere with a bunch of your community from a Pacific island, when do you let go? With ambiguous loss, this is a quote from Pauline Voss, there is no closure. The challenge is to learn to live with the ambiguity. So the Kübler-Ross and complicated grief models emphasize finality, and the Pauline Voss model emphasizes ambiguity. We don't have a paradigm for grief that requires us both to embrace ambiguity and finality. And we don't have a paradigm for grief that is both personal and global, that is both your home and the Arctic that's on fire. This is a lot of material and ways and kinds of grieving to try and put into one coherent psychological space, both as individuals and as a collective, humanity, such that one and we might be able to move forward. And so we're stuck in this kind of gap, which feels like chaos, but is also completely psychologically understandable. So grieving is rarely thought of as something that we do in relation to losses in the natural world, right? I'm having to draw these parallels because we don't have a lot of them. So we don't really know what this grief looks like. Let's say it's not your home. Let's say you're grieving a forest, right? Let's say you are grieving a coastline. Neville Ellis and Ashley Consolo are researchers who've worked with people in very different geographical and ecological contexts for the past 20 years, who are in some way dealing with ecological loss and grief that is particularly of an ecological nature, and not that, a financial, my own home is going underwater kind of thing. So their work shows that people grieve lost landscapes, ecosystems, species, or places that carry personal or collective meaning. So again, it's something that's meaningful. You can mourn a marsh. We don't talk about it, but you can. So for Inuit communities in Canada, melting sea ice has prevented travel to very significant cultural sites and engagement in significant cultural activities. And so those things have been lost. Activities like hunting and fishing. And these disruptions were accompanied by very strong emotional reactions, including grief, anger, sadness, frustration, and despair, right? The sense that the future holds nothing good in it. As one man who grew up hunting and trapping put it, people are not who they are. They're not comfortable and can't do the same things. If something is taken away from you, you don't have it. If a way of life is taken away because of circumstances you have no control over, you lose control over your life. And I'm thinking again of those people who are on the burning earth in Ovid's story, who are not in control of the losses and the devastation that they're seeing around them. This is what it feels like, I think. And so I would suggest that maybe climate grief, one of the particular complications of climate grief, is a loss of control. In the Western Australian wheat belt, chronic drought conditions provoked very similar emotional reactions from family farmers. As one farmer put it, "There's probably nothing worse than seeing your farm go in a dust storm. I reckon it's probably one of the worst feelings. I find that one of the most depressing things of the lot, seeing the farm blow away in a dust storm. That really gets up my nose and a long way up too. If it's blowing dust, I come inside. I just come inside here. I can't stand to watch it." This is similar to, but not the same thing as the denial phase. It's something different. It's something being ripped away that you have no control of, and you can't stand to see it happening. In these two cases of the farmer and the case of the Inuit, the loss is actually concrete in a short-term sense. So flooding made these roads or ways impassable. The farm has gone up in a dust storm. There's something concrete that you can see that's happening. In this case, in this slide, this is the Great Barrier Reef, which I'm sure you've all heard is dying. And the question is whether these circumstances are permanent, and this is where the ambiguity comes in. Is this land going to be farmable again in the future, right? Are these ways going to be passable again, or do we need to let go of them? Certainly conditions are worsening, and all signs point to the fact that they will indeed continue to worsen on this planet. And that leads us to this question of, what we need to let go of. Because we have to decide, both individually and collectively, what we're willing to say is gone so that we can move forward. Because otherwise we're getting in our own way. We're stalling the grief process. We're keeping ourselves locked in that kind of melancholy place. So for Australian family farmers, the ones who are watching their dust storms go away, or the dust storm blow away their farm, the inability to control the landscape also elicited feelings of self-blame and shame. So here's another quote. "Farmers just hate seeing their farm lift. It somehow says to them, I'm a bad farmer. And I think all farmers are good farmers. They all try their hardest to be. They all love their land." Which is reminiscent, this feeling of self-blame and shame is reminiscent of Freud's distinguishing factor of melancholia, which is the disturbance of self-regard. And you see this come out in all of these strange and slightly potentially pathological ways where people who are dealing with the grieving of climate change are sort of turning it inward and becoming self-loathing. There are many examples of this. I won't go into it. I'll just say that this is, I think, a very, very complicated grief indeed. We lack the language to express it, and we lack ways to address it. So, I don't know the finality we need to accept, and I don't know the ambiguity that we need to embrace. I think this is an ongoing conversation, and I think that this is going to be developing. These feelings of grief and the ways that we talk about them are going to continue, as is climate change in all of its many manifestations. But I do think that there are some things that are clear, that are final, and that we are not accepting. So, for example, I was recently in Fiji. I spent 3 years each summer traveling with a conservation biology research team looking at reef health and corals. And the first 2 years we were sort of taking baseline data and looking at this one reef off of the island of Vanuatu. And in between the second and third year, there was record high temperatures, and the ocean warmed and the coral bleached. There was, in the span of 1 week, there was a massive fish die-offs. I don't know if you've seen these pictures. There was in other parts of the world, there were walruses. There was a massive walrus die-off. There was a massive antelope die-off. There have been massive fish die-offs in other places. There are these really apocalyptic images of just bodies and bodies and bodies of animals strewn all over, and no one knows why. They just died. In this case, they knew that the fish died because the water got too hot and they all suffocated and washed up on the shore. And as one person in a village told me, it was like watching their treasure wash out to sea. Because this is their economic livelihood, this is what their culture is built around, and it's just literally washing away and washing up on shore. So that happened, and then the coral bleached because the waters got too warm. Coral are brightly colored because of these tiny little algae that live inside the cells, and when it gets too hot, they expel these little creatures that are the things that actually help them produce energy. So they've gotten rid of their energy-producing symbiotes, and then they have no energy, and then they starve, and then they die. And that's when they become white. So that happened. Then the second strongest storm ever recorded in the southern hemisphere went across the Fijian Islands. And it went across the islands, and it turned around, and it went back. So this was obviously devastation on a scale that is hard to imagine. Imagine that something like, half of your country was affected by a storm. So when we went back, about a month after this, I went back with this research team, and I had been reading about corals and reading about, global temperatures going up, and reading about acidification and reading about pollution and all of the things that are going into the oceans to make them more and more difficult places for things like fish and coral to live. And I went diving that time when I came back, and I could see it. I could see the dead coral, and you could see the line because the water heats from the surface down, and you could see the line up to which things had died, and then under that it would be sort of healthier. And I remember realizing that I was seeing something that probably other generations will not be able to see, because coral reefs, as we know them, are probably gone. It's possible that some corals will adapt evolutionarily very quickly to be able to sustain higher heats, to sustain certain, like living through some kinds of pollutant events. There will be some very deep water corals probably that will survive, but coral reefs, that ecosystem that we know, that landscape, is probably gone. And that's a really, really hard thing to accept and to move on from. Like, what does that mean? We just give up? And I think that letting go and giving up are not the same thing. I think that you have to let go of what is appropriate to let go of in order to fight for what might be left and what might be salvageable. It's possible that you could have some species of coral that can survive warmer temperatures. It's possible that we could, in fact, physically transplant some of them to lower temperatures and try to create new kinds of reefs. So then we would still have some reefs and some fish and something, and that's better than nothing. But if we don't let go, we're not going to use resources appropriately to save what potentially could be saved or salvaged from what is a planet in massive flux. So I think that understanding these grief paradigms is actually potentially really useful for us for understanding how to move forward in addressing climate change. I think we're running out of time. There's a last idea, but I'm actually just going to leave it here, I think, with this idea of the landscape. And I was talking about the landscape of the coral reef. We're talking about, the Arctic Circle being its own landscape. The question that we have to answer is, standing here looking forward from where we are now, what is the visible horizon? What are the points of finality that we understand well enough to know are likely to be final? I think that this is a huge question. I will not attempt to answer it, but I hope that people will work on that. And if you have questions, I'm happy to talk for a little while. It's also very warm in here. So if you just want to get drinks, that's fine too. Thank you. Are there any questions?
I have a question. I found some of the examples used quite interesting in terms of the grief, like talking about the road being flooded, I think it was, or a farm unusable, forests around your parents' house as well. Yet some of these are kind of like the symptoms as to why we have got to the situation like we are, and impact the road and the farm, particularly methane and exhaust fumes. And really, I think what we're looking at perhaps is like a grieving of a planet in which is habitable for humans. And so that, because like it's not the death of the planet if you go to climate change, like it's still an ecosystem if it's just like rats and cockroaches in the post-apocalyptic landscape, like it's still a system that the planet will go on. So therefore, kind of my question is like, going with this grief metaphor and this kind of human mortality metaphor, is our compulsion for climate change a suicidal act? And if it is, instead of kind of focusing on the grief aspect of kind of what's already happened, the outcome is, could we not be focusing on like the process of what's driving us to the suicidal impulse?
So you're talking about Freud's death drive, basically, right? And you're talking about species extinction. I completely agree with you that life is going to be fine. Life is resilient and weird and has been going on for far longer than humans have been around. There will be microbes and things living that are going to survive whatever this age is. The question of species extinction, right, is like, are humans going to survive it? Because there is a tiny little window, which historically has not been the window inside of which the planet existed, right? But we got used to this comfortable sort of window, and now we're messing it up. and some of us more than others are responsible for messing it up. But there is that fear of like, are we at the point where we should start thinking about species extinction? I personally think it's entirely possible. There's no reason that humanity should continue to live just because we like being alive and it's what we're used to, right? But I also don't think we're there yet. I don't think we have to start processing the end of the human species yet. I do think we have to start processing the end of geopolitical systems as we have known them. We have to start processing the end of the use of fossil fuels, or we will get there. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I think I was thinking more kind of like the selfish nature of the way that we look at climate change. Like we're just looking at it as the impact of like us and the livability of the planet
for us.
Humans. Yeah.
I mean, different people look at it differently, right? There are ecological movements, and in fact, the conservation movement that started in the, I'm going to get this wrong, like 60s and 70s maybe, certainly in the US, I don't know as much about that movement in the UK or Europe, was predicated on this idea of sort of nature for nature's sake. You know, that nature is beautiful and deserves to continue and deserves to be kind of pristine, which is actually a misunderstanding of what nature is. The idea that it has ever been static is also sort of a falsehood. So that ecological paradigm, I think, still exists for a lot of people who genuinely believe that we are not the center of this universe and that we want to try and preserve things because they are beautiful, they are here, there are other sentient creatures on this planet that we should be working for and with. And there's also a new, to me, sort of worrying movement to quantify the value of nature for humans, right? So quantifying things in terms of food security, in terms of income, right? So when coral reefs go, they're going to take about 7% of the world's protein. We're gonna have to make that up somehow. So there's value in saving them for us, right? So you can make these arguments for saving the reefs that have nothing to do with beauty or fish or snorkeling or the like magic of nature, but that are just like, we need protein. There are other arguments that are based on local economies, right? Like the fisheries that are working to harvest the fish. That shifts the focus, just like you're talking about, sort of to us, right? That our needs and what we want out of this earth are the thing that matters. I think this is an ongoing philosophical debate about how and what to save and why we should be saving it. I'm trying to figure out if I care. Like, I'm trying to figure out if I care which reasons we choose for saving things, and I guess it matters if we choose to save different things. But I think this is also a really an interesting and ongoing debate.
Or if we're just honest.
What that leaves out is that biodiversity is essential for the survival of every single species, from the microorganism in the soil, which makes our food valuable, which keeps the soil from flying away, to us and the bigger mammals.
Yeah.
So it's nothing to do with the magic of nature and liking the very animals or something that have a right to exist. We are all interdependent. And you can't have one without the other.
Which I think is why conservation is moving away, conservation as if it's a monolith, but many conservationists are moving away from a model of trying to save species and trying to save ecosystems, because even if you save what are considered keystone species like a shark on a coral reef, it doesn't mean that you preserve biodiversity necessarily, and there's this growing understanding that you need to save whole ecosystems, not just the cutest and the furriest and the most sort of palatable mammals, usually. Yeah.
So moving on a bit from that notion of ecosystems, one of the things I've been thinking or wondering about is how do you think concepts or feelings of these cultures vary between cultures who are maybe living a less energy-intensive lifestyle, say for example, some of the communities in Africa where their use of energy compared
think that's a great question. And I think culturally, different cultures have different ways of dealing with grief and mourning, and some have better and worse ways, I think, you know, in the sense of both communal and individual rituals that help people move on. I would say that the United States is exceptionally bad at death. We don't have good rituals. We have sort of brief and stilted moments at an open casket, maybe, and then we put it in the ground and everyone moves on. Some cultures have, you know, days and weeks and months and even, you know, a year of ritual mourning and things you do to sort of pass a person along. In terms of the question about how climate grief is affecting people who on the ground feel more or less responsible, that's also really complicated by the question of development in countries which have not heretofore been particularly responsible for climate change, but are now economically sort of catching up and trying to catch up to those countries that have been responsible for it thus far. So, you know, in India or China, the people there, like, you can't tell us we can't get air conditioners. You can't tell us we can't build nice homes. You can't tell us we can't get on planes because you guys messed it up for us. Like, this is our chance. This is now. Our economies are booming. We are getting air conditioners, and this is great. And we don't want to talk about the effects of climate change. Again, this is like a massive generalization, but I think which is sort of an answer. Like, your question, I think, is so big. The idea of like grief in a culture as relates to energy use or output, I think it's probably also incredibly varied. I think there are probably people who worry about it and hate themselves in India for buying an air conditioner. I don't know. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Talking about air conditioners, I wonder what you think about what you just said, or your idea that you put tonight, might work in a conversation or a negotiation of policy making with corporations who are obviously the only policy makers in our world, at least in the West, but actually everywhere. So, do you see that as a possible way of talking about things and getting things done, or rather as I could also think with the side of my brain, it's too sad to even go there.
Do you mean in negotiations?
We can talk about letting go and deciding, you know, the difference between giving up and letting go in terms of policy making and then in terms of corporations.
I think it's important maybe to have those questions about what we are letting go of in order to figure out what we are setting our sights on. But I also think it's sort of a fallacy to believe that corporations are going to be the things that get us out of this, because they're the things that got us in this, and their interests are far too entwined with, for example, international economies based on the model of growth. If you can find for me a corporation that's fine with getting smaller, and maybe making less profit, they might be one to talk to. But in some ways, I think that's almost the wrong level at which to address the problem. But I don't know. Is probably a better answer to that.
It touches somewhere on the point you made about giving things that haven't been given value in an economic sense more value. You know, the protein produces that we're going to lose. There is a way in which capitalism and corporations and all that have just not seen the resources they've used. And we've been part of that in terms of how we live. So it's not just them, it's us too. But beginning to put an economic value on things that haven't ever given an economic value is another way of trying to get the arguments up the thing.
I think it's a way of creating language about it for people who would not normally be able to talk about it or want to talk about it. So it is a way of, in some ways, of broadening the dialogue, right? If you start talking about food security and safety, you know, perhaps more people are interested. I also think we can talk about cultural value, right? Something doesn't have to have economic value to be a thing that we decide is worth fighting for. And so maybe some of this conversation has to be around cultural value, which is not the same thing as nature for nature's sake, and it's not the same thing as, you know, we need protein, so let's save the reefs, but is a fundamental shift in value and values that we share, and therefore what we're doing around those things.
But, I mean, there's somebody who's called Eric Bishop, who's an academic at Ovid University, who's done a most fantastic piece of work which puts economic value on the natural resources that we take for granted. Some people treat as though they're expensive. And he can demonstrate the economic value of a few trees in the city centre in pounds, and it's huge. And he uses this when talking to local planners and local authorities. It's a language which they understand, and more importantly, it's language which they can incorporate if they want to, in order to win the argument of the vested interests who are working against that sort of thing.
I think it can be a useful tool. I think that language can be useful. I'm not sure it's like the solution or the end point. Yeah. So I'm really hot and would love to sit down. You all might want a beverage and or just to walk outside and breathe some fresh air. So I think we'll end it there, if that's okay. Thank you.